You're listening to Kingdom Thinking, a podcast series designed to start a conversation around the deeper intellectual questions surrounding life, faith, and meaning. Here are a collection of questions, ideas, and stories that I hope will challenge you to think about your own beliefs, and perhaps introduce you to new perspectives, regardless of where you are in your journey. I'm your host, Al Butcher, and I can't wait to share this episode with you. This episode will explore one of the strongest criticisms of the Christian faith, the problem of evil and suffering. If God is so good and so powerful, then where does evil come from? Does its presence contradict the biblical narrative? This week, I want to address a point that I raised in the last podcast, but I had to skip over because I really needed to set aside an entire episode to give this topic the time it deserves. Well, I always keep my promises, and here we are together again, talking about the problem of evil and suffering. The earliest expression of the problem of evil was by a Greek philosopher named Epicurus, who was having an argument, as philosophers tend to do, with his colleague Aristotle. Epicurus posed a dilemma which has been called the Epicurean paradox, a name which you can promptly forget if it doesn't help you remember it. The essential part of the paradox that particularly relates to Christianity is the following thought. If God is both all good and all powerful, then where does the evil and suffering in the world come from? It's important to recognize that this problem isn't really an issue for the atheist. The atheist does not have to answer the problem of evil, for he doesn't even believe that evil exists, or if he does, he could simply say that it occurs due to the random forces that created the universe. It is Christians, with their strong stances on morality and belief in things that are right and wrong, who have to answer this problem. Now, when answering the problem of evil, it's important to understand that there are two things at play here. The first is a logical exercise, the argument that since evil exists, God cannot or is quite unlikely to exist. The second is that many people who have experienced suffering may find it extremely difficult to reconcile the supposed goodness of God with his apparent willingness to permit the suffering which has occurred in their life. I'd like to address these two arguments in order. First, looking at the more logical side of the problem, it's argued that the presence of evil and suffering in our universe makes God's existence either impossible or unlikely. Because, after all, if an all-good God, an all-powerful God, truly existed, wouldn't he simply intervene to stop all the evil and suffering in the world? Since it doesn't seem that he's done this, perhaps he doesn't exist. However, a key thought that is overlooked when we think like this is that God may have morally good reasons for permitting some evil and suffering to occur. In fact, he might even have reasons for allowing suffering to occur that we might not at all know about. With this in mind, I want to offer 3 points in response to this logical problem of evil. First, I want to argue that, all things considered, we aren't really in a very good position to assess even the likelihood that God has good reasons for the suffering that occurs, never mind coming close to figuring out what those reasons may or may not be. Second, I want to discuss how suffering fits into the biblical narrative, and is in fact an integral part of it, such that suffering is really no surprise to the Christian worldview. Finally, I'd like to broaden the horizons of exploration, and maybe argue that we need to look at all of the evidence, not just some of it. Firstly, looking at our position. I want you to think for yourself of a difficult time in your life, but one that yielded growth for you. I'm sure many of us can think of such a time either in our life or in the life of someone else, where enduring brief suffering led to a positive outcome. Then we have to concede that it's at least possible that some suffering can have positive outcomes. Then here what we need to recognize is that ultimately we're finite persons. We live for a finite amount of time, we are only able to know a finite number of things, and we can only live through a finite number of experiences. So much of even our own suffering we cannot see or comprehend the full outcomes and purposes of our suffering as we go through it. much less be able to see such things for the entire world around us. However, God, if he existed, would be able to see the end through to the beginning, and as he achieves his purposes through human free decisions, he may use a certain evil to achieve a greater good within his framework. This isn't just a simple appeal to the cliche, God works in mysterious ways, but rather an argument that we have no way of knowing that he doesn't work in mysterious ways. To paraphrase a quote from Timothy Keller, the pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in Manhattan, if God is big and powerful enough for you to get angry at him for allowing suffering to occur, then he is also big and powerful enough to have reasons for allowing suffering that you may never understand. Suffering happening now may have ripple effects that may not emerge until centuries later, and perhaps only in another country. We would simply have no way of knowing. Therefore, we cannot argue that much of the world's suffering is pointless, only that it seems pointless to our finite monkey brains, and that is much more a statement of ignorance than a logical disproof. Secondly, I want to address the simple fact that evil is just not a surprise to the Christian worldview. In fact, there are key doctrines within Christianity that paint evil and suffering as an unpleasant but possibly necessary part of God's plan and working within the world. First, as I expounded upon in the first episode, mankind is in a state of rebellion against God. We have failed to keep his moral law that he gave to us, and the Bible teaches that God allowed mankind to make its choice and reap the consequences of those choices. Consequently, much of the terrible human evil in this world, even within the church, comes as no real surprise to the Christian. In fact, she'd expect it, knowing the state of the human heart and our failure to keep God's law. This narrative of humans continually choosing to disobey God is evident right from the earliest chapters of Genesis. I mean, we get about 9 pages into the Bible. Don't quote me, your version might be different. But we get 9 pages into the Bible before humans are choosing to go their own way and do what they want to do, instead of what they really should. In fact, Christianity argues that these choices not only account for the existence of human evils and actions, but that our sinfulness has disrupted the very fabric of creation. God gave us a limited dominion over creation, and as a consequence, the effects of our rebellion are felt through the earth and the universe. Now, this is not to say that things like natural disasters or diseases are God's way of punishing people, but rather that they're a natural consequence of our rebellion. The pan which burns the child's hand for touching it is not punishing the child. That's just what happens when you touch hot metal. However, why would God even permit such suffering in the first place? Well, the second thing we ought to understand is that we're not God's pets. One reason why the problem of evil is such a difficult problem to think through is that we frequently assume that if an all-powerful and all-good God exists, then his primary goal for human life is for us to be happy and comfortable. But unfortunately, this idea simply doesn't stand up to the Christian narrative. Rather, as is written in the Westminster Shorter Catechism, man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. So, plenty of suffering which may not seem to produce any human happiness in this world may in fact produce the knowledge of God and ability to glorify him, either in this life or the next. Following from this, the Apostle Paul, a man who over his life would be arrested multiple times, beaten multiple times, tortured multiple times, shipwrecked twice, bitten by a snake, whipped, and eventually executed, wrote in his second letter to the Corinthian church the following: "Therefore we do not give up, for our momentary light affliction is producing for us an absolutely incomparable eternal weight of glory." Paul here has an understanding that his sufferings are moving him closer to a greater knowledge of God and a greater experience of him. and he seems to consider it well worth the trade. In fact, Paul's lifetime of suffering seems to pale in comparison to what is offered by his God. To quote William Lane Craig in his article on the problem of evil, to know God, the source of infinite goodness and love, is an incomparable good, the fulfillment of human existence. The sufferings of this life cannot even be compared to it. Finally, I want to argue that when we narrow our view of the universe to only look at the evil present within it, it might seem relatively easy to dismiss the existence of God. But as much as we Christians have a problem of evil, now the atheistic worldview must also confront one of its own greatest criticisms, the problem of goodness and beauty. Why is a sunset so beautiful? How is it that without God, a bunch of monkeys standing on a wet ball flying through the furthest corners of space are able to fall in love with one another, or are able to experience kindness, beauty, and wonder? To quote Shane Clifton, a quadriplegic and dean of theology at Alpha Crucis College, "Nevertheless, in addition to hating this bloody, broken body, I have also come to appreciate that life is wondrous, and sometimes even sacred. This is not to weigh the good against the bad, but rather, at one and the same time, to see the wonder and tragedy of life, and to identify God in both." This position isn't irrational or anti-science, but instead understands God as the ground of the laws of nature and beauty of the natural world. So, while God isn't the cause of evil, I have found that the experience of the Spirit, sensed in the darkest of times, has provided hope and given my life meaning. When we look at both all the goodness and evil in the world, only then can we really achieve a balanced view of what is going on. Thus, all things considered, the presence of evil and suffering in the world doesn't really render the existence of God all that impossible. In fact, the Christian worldview may provide the best explanation for the presence of both evil and suffering and goodness and beauty in our world today. But for many of us, this may not be enough. Many may be going through a period of personal suffering or have gone through extremely deep difficulties, and it seems impossible to believe that God even exists or is good considering what has happened. To those in this space, I'd simply like to quote Professor Alvin Plantinga and what he said on this issue. "As the Christian sees things, God does not stand idly by, coolly observing the suffering of his people. He enters into and shares our suffering. He endures the anguish of seeing his Son, the second person of the Trinity, consigned to the bitterly cruel and shameful death of the cross." So, even though evil may, as I conceded earlier, be the greatest objection to the existence of God, at the end of the day, God presents the only real solution to the problem of evil. God is the final answer to this problem because he shared in our suffering. Through him, we have access to the promise in Revelation chapter 21 that he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things of this world have passed away. Thank you for listening to this episode of Kingdom Thinking. I release new episodes every week, so jump on the Kingdom Thinking Facebook page for notifications about episodes as they come out, as well as information about the episodes like transcripts. Until next time, have a great week and God bless.